Now we get to the good stuff, looping. And again, I made an example of where that this is something that you would use if you want to do something repetitive. We've seen this example before, and Python comes with something built in called a for loop, which allows you to do something repetitive to, for example, in our case, a list of things. Now, again, we haven't done conditionals yet, so we can't see the full power of looping, but you can at least see or practice the repetitive manner in which loops work. So if you look at how loops work with lists, then we have to make sure that we also understand that just as with strings, when we did strings, we saw that there was this in that we could use to check if something occurs within something, within that string. For example, we had a DNA sequence, and we wanted to check whether ATG was in that sequence. Then we could say ATG in string or in your DNA sequence. And if you got, usually your output is a Boolean, true or false. If it's in there, it would say true, and false if not. So you can do that same thing with lists. You can, for example, say fish in species. Now, obviously, when we talk, we say is fish in species, but there's no is in this Python for this function. So you'll just say fish in species, and assign that to variable name fish, and then bat in species. It's all about the intonation. So bat in species, assign that to bat, and then if I print it to, then I will see true for fish, but bat isn't in there, so it returned the false. Now imagine if you had a list containing 10,000 species, right? And you wanted to do something to every individual item in here, okay? Maybe you also have another list that contains a smaller group of species. Maybe the group of species that you're working with, and you want to see if that smaller group of species is within this larger group. Then obviously you could use a for loop, or you would want to use a for loop, especially if you're working with, you've got 96 species that you want to check in a group of 10,000 or 100,000 species. So in that case, the for loop comes in because firstly, it would be very boring to do all of that manually. Secondly, it will take a very long time, and you're not going to get a PhD out of doing something like that. And also, it's very error prone. Now, if you're Excel savvy, you could have done it in Excel, but why not script it since we are using Python? So the for loop instructs your code to read through every element in that specific data type that you're working with. Now, we're working with lists, so it's going to instruct it to look at all the items in your list from the first to the last, so it goes sequentially. It always starts at the first one, and to do whatever you say it must do to it in your code. And it's going to do that same thing to every element. But if you have conditionals, again, we're doing that in the next chapter, you could say, if this is in there, do something like this to it. If something else is in there, do something else to it. But in our case, we're just going to do the same thing. The structure of it is that it always says for something in a bigger thing, in this case lists. It always ends in a colon. And now we're going to see something really important, which is indentation. That is very important in Python. So if you've got anything that has a colon, the line that follows it will not be directly underneath, but there will be by convention we use 4 spaces, but there has to be a space or a tab, 4 spaces or a tab, and you have to stick to that convention. You can't go, a tab is 4 spaces anyway, so sometimes I'm going to use a tab, and sometimes I'm going to click on my spacebar 4 times, because you're going to get an error. It wants you to stick to whatever it is that you chose to use. Okay, so you would say for every element in your list, colon, do whatever, do something. So let's say we wanted to say we have this group of species that we worked with before. I'm not going to go up. But you have a group of species and you want to say the first species is not a computer, the second species is not a computer, until we get to the end, right? So that's where you could use a for loop. Now you could, if you wanted to, use indexing and say species 0 is not a computer, and you could copy it and just change this from 0, 1, 2, but that's the power of the for loop. So this part, obviously, the for and the in species, that part you have to stick to. If you made this list called species, then obviously you can't call this something else because it's going to say this doesn't exist. But this part here, this variable name, you can choose yourself. You could say for X in species or whatever. I'm obviously using something that's intuitive to me. Okay, so I said animal. So for animal in species, print, and then it's going to print the animal is not a computer. Okay, so if you print that, we will see it's doing this to every item in here. What we need to say is, this is almost like when you created an empty list, in the sense that at the start, that variable name animal has nothing in it, but it gets activated by this for. So if it was for something, then all of a sudden it goes, wait, I'm being initialized to store something. And it's going to go, I need to get whatever I need to store within myself from this species. All right, so it's like animal is like a woman going shopping for a species. And initially, before she walks into the shop, she doesn't have any species that she bought. But the minute there's a for, she's in the shop. And now she's going, oh, what is here to buy in the shop? And she sees there's species to buy. And she goes, okay, I want to own human, oh, what the heck, I want to own everything. So it goes and it takes human, then fish, then, and it goes all of that, and it's now holding, but one at a time. So it's like she goes into the shop, she buys a human, she puts it in a car. That sounds so bad. She goes back into the shop, and then she goes and she gets fish and she puts it in a car, and she does that over and over again until she gets all the way to the end here by Eagle. And then she said, oh, now I'm tired of shopping. I've got everything I wanted. But she goes from the first to the last, and she does something to it. In her case, this would have been for animal in species by animal. But obviously, we're doing something else now, right? So we're just saying, for human in species, print human is not a computer. Then it goes here and it goes for fish in species, fish is not a computer. And every time it goes back around this loop, it's going to continue, it's going to go human, print this, and then it's going to go, wait, I'm in a for loop, so I can't get out of this, because a for loop is a command for me to go from the start to the end until this list is empty. So I can't stop here. I have to go back up and go see what else is there. Then it goes to fish, and now it's storing fish, and then it prints, and it continues to there, and only when it gets to eagle and it goes, oh, there's nothing else here. Okay, now I can get out. And so when you have this for loop, normally what you would see is, for example, if I print this now, if I print animal, it will store eagle, because the last thing it had in here was eagle. So it's gonna hold that last. Okay, and like I said, there has to be a colon, something that's also often forgotten. You have to put the colon there. It's always for something in something. This part changes. This doesn't have to be just one line. This can be multiple lines, depending on what you want to accomplish. This is called, the part underneath the indentation. In our case, it's just one line, but this is called a block of code, or the body of the for loop. So you could see this as the head if you want to, I suppose. Okay, so yeah, this is just saying when it sees the for, it initializes actually, I would say it kind of initializes the variable name that's going to change all the time. That's going to store different things. So it's kind of like it's initializing animal, so that it can keep occupying things. And it takes the first one all the way through till it gets to the last one, which in our case is element number 6 or -1. Remember, if you're going from the back, and then it exits the loop once it goes to the end.